Berlin, Führerbunker, March 1945. The air in the map room tasted of concrete dust and stale cigarette smoke. Adolf Hitler stood before the large table, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the colored pins scattered across the map of Europe like a child's abandoned game. The pins that once marched triumphantly across France, Poland, and into the heart of Russia now clustered defensively around a shrinking perimeter. But it wasn't the Eastern Front that held his attention tonight. It was the absence. The absence of chaos across the Atlantic. For months, no, years, he had waited for the reports. The strikes. The sabotage. The internal collapse of the American industrial machine that his intelligence services had promised him was inevitable. Canaris had assured him. Himmler's SD had confirmed it. The Abwehr reports, thick with details, had painted a picture of a nation fractured, vulnerable, ripe for internal destruction. The Americans are soft, they had told him. Their factories are unguarded. Their workers are restless. Their infrastructure is exposed. One well-placed operation, and their war machine grinds to a halt. He had believed them. He had needed to believe them. Because if America's industrial output continued unchecked, if those factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland kept pouring out tanks, planes, and ships by the thousands, then the mathematics of this war became unsolvable. Germany could not outproduce a nation that turned automobiles into bombers as easily as flipping a switch. Hitler's fingers traced the edge of the table. His left hand trembled slightly, a tremor he could no longer fully control. He pressed it flat against the wood. "Where are the reports?" he asked quietly. The officers behind him shifted. No one answered immediately. "Where?" he repeated, his voice still soft. "Are the reports from America?" General Oberst Jodl stepped forward, a folder tucked under his arm. His face was drawn, the skin around his eyes tight with exhaustion. "Mein Führer, the latest intelligence summaries are here. However, Jodl hesitated. The information is limited." Hitler turned slowly. His pale blue eyes fixed on Jodl with an intensity that made the general's throat tighten. "Limited," Hitler repeated, tasting the word. "Limited. We have operatives. We have networks. We have spent years building intelligence channels into the United States. And you tell me the information is limited? The networks have gone silent, Mein Führer. Many of our agents were rounded up in 1942 and 1943. The FBI. The FBI, Hitler interrupted, his voice rising slightly, is a domestic police force. They are not the Gestapo. They are not trained for counterintelligence on this scale. How could they? He stopped himself. Took a breath. Forced his voice back down. Show me what we have. Jodl opened the folder. The pages inside were thin, sparse. He began to read in a monotone, as if reciting a death sentence. Report from Agent Tramp, dated January 1945. Observes increased production at Willow Run Plant, Michigan. No operational details. No vulnerabilities identified. He turned the page. Report from Asset Peasant, dated February 1945. Notes heavy security at Oak Ridge Facility, Tennessee. Unable to penetrate perimeter. No further contact. Another page. Report from. Stop. Hitler raised his hand. The room fell silent except for the distant rumble of artillery, Soviet artillery, creeping closer each day. These are not intelligence reports, Hitler said quietly. These are observations. Tourist observations. A man standing outside a fence, writing down what he sees. No one contradicted him. Where are the sabotage operations? Hitler asked. Where are the strikes we coordinated with sympathetic labor groups? Where are the explosions, the derailments, the factory fires? Jodl's jaw tightened. Mein Führer, our attempts to coordinate with American isolationist groups and labor organizers were unsuccessful. The groups we contacted either refused cooperation or were themselves under surveillance. Several of our couriers were arrested before making contact. Hitler stared at him. And the saboteurs we sent? The trained operatives? Operation Pastorius, 1942, Jodl said carefully. All 8 operatives captured within 2 weeks of landing. 6 executed. I know about Pastorius, Hitler snapped. That was 3 years ago. What about since then? There have been no successful operations on American soil, Mein Führer. The words hung in the air like a confession. Hitler turned back to the map. His eyes moved across the Atlantic to the small pins marking American positions. Pins in Britain. Pins in France. Pins advancing through Germany itself. They told me, Hitler said softly, that America was unprepared. That their factories were vulnerable. That their society was too divided, too individualistic, too weak to sustain a war effort. He touched one of the pins, a blue one, marking an American armored division. They told me that one good strike, one coordinated operation, could cripple their production for months. That we only needed to delay them. To buy time. His hand closed around the pin. He pulled it from the map and held it up to the light. They told me, he whispered, that we had the advantage. Behind him, the officers stood frozen. They had learned long ago that Hitler's quiet moments were more dangerous than his rages. Hitler placed the pin back on the map, not where it had been, but further east. Closer to Berlin. How many tanks did the Americans produce last year, he asked. Jodl consulted his notes. Approximately 17,000, Mein Führer. In aircraft? 96,000. In ships? Jodl's voice dropped. We estimate over 2,000 naval vessels of all classes. Hitler nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. And how many of their factories did we destroy? Silence. How many of their trains did we derail? Silence. How many of their workers did we turn against their government? The silence stretched. It filled the room like water rising in a sealed chamber. Hitler walked to the window, or rather, to the concrete wall where a window had once been. The bunker had no windows now. Only walls. Only depth. I was told, he said, his back to the room, that their intelligence services were amateurish. That the FBI was concerned only with gangsters and bank robbers. That the OSS was a collection of Wall Street dilettantes playing at espionage. He turned. I was told that our intelligence was superior. That the Abwehr, the SD, the networks we had built over decades, that these would give us the edge we needed. His voice remained calm, but his eyes had changed. There was something in them now that hadn't been there before. Something cold and final. I was told many things, Hitler said. And I believed them. Because I needed to believe them. Because if they were not true, then this war was lost the moment America entered it. He walked back to the table. Placed both hands flat on the surface. Leaned forward. Bring me Kaltenbrunner, he said quietly. Bring me every intelligence officer who filed reports about American vulnerabilities. Bring me everyone who told me we could strike at the heart of their war machine. Mein Führer. Bring them to me, Hitler repeated, his voice still soft, still controlled. Because I want to ask them a very simple question. He looked up. His eyes moved across each face in the room. I want to ask them, where's the chaos? The question hung in the air. Where are the burning factories? Where are the derailed supply trains? Where are the strikes, the riots, the internal collapse we were promised? His voice finally rose, the control slipping. Where is the America we were told existed? The shout echoed off the concrete walls. Then, slowly, Hitler straightened. Smoothed his uniform. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet once more. They are producing more in a month than we produce in a year. Their factories run 24 hours a day, untouched, unafraid. Their workers, these soft, individualistic Americans we were told would never sacrifice, are buying war bonds and working double shifts. He picked up another pin, a red one, marking a German position. And we, he said softly, are here. In a hole. Beneath the earth. Waiting. He placed the red pin down. Not on the map. Beside it. I want to know, Hitler said, how our intelligence failed so completely. I want to know who told us we could win a war against a nation we never understood. I want to know. He stopped. Took a breath. I want to know when the lie began. No one answered. Because there was no answer. The lie had begun with the first report that told them what they wanted to hear. It had continued with every assessment that confirmed their assumptions. It had grown with every operation that failed but was reported as delayed. It had become truth through repetition, through wishful thinking, through the desperate need to believe that the mathematics of industrial warfare could be overcome by willpower alone. Hitler looked at the map one last time. At the pins. At the shrinking red territory. At the advancing blue. Leave me, he said quietly. The officers filed out, grateful for the dismissal. Hitler remained. Alone with the map. Alone with the silence from across the ocean. The silence that told him everything his intelligence services had not. Willow Run, Michigan, December 1942. The night shift at Willow Run began at midnight. By 12:15 a.m., the assembly line was already moving, a river of metal and rivets flowing through the largest room under one roof in the world. The building stretched for over a mile, and inside it, B-24 Liberator bombers were born at a rate that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. One every 63 minutes. Karl-Heinz Weber stood at the edge of the parking lot, watching the third shift workers stream through the gates. He held a thermos of coffee, cold now, and a newspaper folded under his arm. To anyone watching, he was just another worker arriving early, killing time before clocking in. But Karl-Heinz Weber was not his real name. And he was not there to build bombers. He had been in America for 7 years. Long enough to lose most of his accent. Long enough to marry an American girl, a secretary from Dearborn who believed his story about fleeing the Nazis. Long enough to build a life that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. Long enough to almost forget why he had come. Almost. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago. Not through the mail, that would have been too dangerous. It came through a contact in Chicago, a man who ran a printing shop and asked no questions. The message was brief, encoded in a business correspondence about paper supplies. The time has come. Proceed with objective. Confirm when complete. Karl had read it twice, then burned it in his kitchen sink. He had known this moment would arrive eventually. He had been trained for it in a farmhouse outside Hamburg in 1935, when the Abwehr was still building its networks, still believing that the next war could be won through intelligence and sabotage as much as through tanks and planes. You will be a sleeper, his handler had told him. You will live among them. Work among them. Become one of them. And when the time comes, you will strike at the heart of their war machine. 7 years. 7 years of waiting. 7 years of watching America transform from a nation still scarred by depression into an industrial colossus that seemed to grow stronger every month. Karl took a sip of cold coffee and watched the workers. Thousands of them. Men and women, white and black, young and old. They came in cars and buses, carrying lunch pails and thermoses, talking and laughing despite the hour. He had worked alongside them for 18 months now. He knew their names. Their families. Their complaints about supervisors and their pride in the work they did. We're building freedom, one of them had told him last week, a welder named Tommy who had a brother in the Pacific. Every plane that rolls out of here is another chance to bring our boys home. Karl had nodded and smiled, because that's what Karl-Heinz Weber would do. But now, standing in the cold Michigan night, he felt the weight of the small package in his coat pocket. 3 pounds of plastic explosive, smuggled piece by piece over 6 months. Enough to destroy a critical junction in the electrical system. Enough to shut down the line for weeks, maybe months. Enough to matter. He checked his watch. 12:47 a.m. In 13 minutes, he would clock in. In 30 minutes, he would reach his station near the electrical substation. In 45 minutes, during the scheduled break, he would plant the device with a timer set for 3 a.m., long after he had clocked out and driven away. The plan was simple. Clean. Untraceable. He had rehearsed it 100 times in his mind. Carl crushed the empty thermos cup and dropped it in a trash bin. He started walking toward the gate, joining the stream of workers. His badge was ready. His story was ready. His hands were steady. This is what you were trained for, he told himself. This is why you came. But as he approached the gate, something made him pause. A new checkpoint had been installed since yesterday, a temporary structure with 2 guards and a table. Workers were being stopped randomly, bags checked, questions asked. Carl's pulse quickened. This wasn't part of the pattern. Security had been consistent for months, predictable. This was new. He watched as a worker ahead of him was pulled aside. The guard asked to see inside his lunch pail. The worker complied, joking about whether they were looking for stolen rivets. The guard smiled but checked thoroughly before waving him through. Carl's hand moved unconsciously to his coat pocket. The package was small, well concealed, but not invisible. Not if they searched carefully. Abort, a voice in his head said. Come back tomorrow. But tomorrow might bring more security. Tomorrow the moment might be lost. He stepped forward, badge ready. Evening, the guard said. Young kid, maybe 22. Probably 4F, unable to serve overseas. Rough shift to start, huh? Every shift's rough, Carl said with a tired smile. But the pay's good. The guard glanced at his badge. Weber. You're in Section C. That's right. How long you been here? Year and a half, about. The guard nodded, then looked past him at the line forming behind. All right, go ahead. Carl started to move. Hold on, the guard said. Carl stopped. His heart hammered against his ribs. Your coat, the guard said. Can you open it for me? Time seemed to slow. Carl could hear his own breathing. Could feel the weight of the package like a stone. Sure, he heard himself say. His fingers moved to the buttons. Slowly. Naturally. As if he had nothing to hide. The guard stepped closer. And then a voice called out from behind, Hey, Jenkins. Need you over here. The guard turned. Another worker was arguing with the second guard, something about a forgotten badge. The situation was escalating. Go ahead, Jenkins said to Carl, distracted. Keep moving. Carl buttoned his coat and walked through the gate. His legs felt like water. Inside the factory, the noise was overwhelming, a symphony of riveting, welding, shouting, and machinery. Carl made his way to the time clock, punched in, and headed towards Section C. His station was near the electrical substation, just as planned. The device in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. 45 minutes, he thought. Just 45 minutes. But as he walked through the factory floor, something began to gnaw at him. The faces. He saw Mary, the grandmother who worked the rivet gun and talked about her grandson in North Africa. He saw James, the black man from Detroit who had finally gotten a factory job after years of being turned away, who spoke about this work like it was dignity made manifest. He saw Susan, barely 18, who inspected welds with a precision that put men twice her age to shame. He saw Tommy, the welder, who waved at him from across the floor. These are the enemy, Carl told himself. These are the people building the machines that kill your countrymen. But they didn't look like enemies. They looked like people working a night shift. Carl reached his station. The electrical substation was 20 feet away, behind a chain-link fence with a simple padlock. He had the key, copied months ago. The timer was set. Everything was ready. He looked at the clock on the wall. 1:32 a.m. 13 minutes until break. He began his work, hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. Around him, the assembly line flowed. A fuselage moved past on the conveyor. Wings were attached. Engines mounted. Instruments installed. One every 63 minutes. Carl thought about the mathematics. If he succeeded, the line would stop for weeks. Maybe 100 planes would never be built. Maybe 1,000 sorties would never be flown. Maybe the war would last a few days longer. Maybe a few more German soldiers would live. Maybe. The brake whistle blew. Workers set down tools and headed for the break room. Carl stood, his hand moving to his pocket. This was the moment. He walked toward the substation, key ready. And stopped. Because he realized something that made his blood run cold. It wouldn't matter. Even if he succeeded. Even if he destroyed this junction, shut down this line, delayed production for a month, it wouldn't matter. Because there were other factories. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. Across Michigan, across Ohio, across Pennsylvania, in California and Texas. Factories that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, pouring out an endless stream of tanks and planes and ships. He was one man with 3 pounds of explosive. And America was a continent of factories. The mathematics were impossible. Carl stood frozen, his hand on the key in his pocket. He thought about his handler in Hamburg, about the reports he had sent describing vulnerabilities and opportunities. He thought about the Abwehr analysts who would read those reports and believe that sabotage could make a difference. He thought about Hitler, somewhere in Berlin, looking at maps and believing that American production could be disrupted. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins, that they were all living in a fantasy. The America they had described in their intelligence briefings, divided, vulnerable, soft, did not exist. This America, the one he had lived in for 7 years, was something else entirely. It was Mary and James and Susan and Tommy, multiplied by millions, working through the night because they believed it mattered. It was a nation that had turned its entire industrial capacity toward a single purpose with a speed and scale that defied comprehension. It was Willow Run, producing a bomber every 63 minutes. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Carl turned away from the substation. He walked back to his station. He sat down and waited for the break to end. When the whistle blew, he returned to work. That night, after his shift ended, he drove to a bridge over the Rouge River. He stood in the darkness and threw the package into the water. Then he went home to his wife and never spoke of it again. 3 months later, a report reached Berlin from Agent Tramp. Willow Run production continues at high capacity. Security remains tight. No operational opportunities identified at this time. The report was filed, read, and forgotten. No one asked why Agent Tramp had stopped sending detailed assessments. No one asked why his reports had become vague observations from outside the fence. No one asked because, by then, there were too many other reports saying the same thing. And because, deep down, they were beginning to understand what Agent Tramp had understood that night in December 1942. That the war was already over. They just hadn't admitted it yet. Führerbunker, Berlin, April 20th, 1945. Hitler's 56th birthday passed without ceremony. There was cake, dry, made with ersatz ingredients that tasted of sawdust and desperation. There were well wishes from the officers who remained, their voices hollow, their eyes avoiding his. There was a brief gathering in the conference room, where men stood in uncomfortable silence, waiting for permission to leave. Hitler dismissed them after 10 minutes. Now, in the early hours of April 21st, he sat alone in his private quarters. The walls pressed in around him, concrete and steel, buried deep beneath a city that was eating itself alive. Above ground, Soviet artillery pounded Berlin into rubble. The sound was constant, a rhythmic thunder that shook dust from the ceiling with each impact. On the small table before him lay a stack of folders. Intelligence reports. Production estimates. Assessment documents dating back to 1940. He had spent the past week reading them. All of them. Every optimistic projection, every confident assessment, every report that had told him what he wanted to hear. American industrial capacity is overestimated. Their workforce lacks the discipline of German labor. Strategic sabotage operations will create cascading failures in their production chain. The American people lack the will for sustained sacrifice. Hitler's hand, trembling more noticeably now, reached for one particular document. A 1941 assessment from the Abwehr, stamped Geheim in red ink. He had read it dozens of times in the past days. Each time, the words seemed more absurd. The United States industrial base, while large, is oriented toward consumer production and lacks the infrastructure for rapid military conversion. Conservative estimates suggest they will require 24 to 36 months to achieve significant war production capacity. This window provides ample opportunity for disruption operations. Hitler set the document down carefully, as if it might crumble to dust. 36 months. They had given America 36 months to become a threat. It had taken 18. By 1943, American factories were producing more war material in a single month than Germany produced in a year. By 1944, the numbers had become so lopsided that German intelligence officers stopped including them in briefings, because the figures seemed like errors, like someone had misplaced a decimal point. But they weren't errors. America had built 16 fleet carriers in the time it took Germany to complete one battleship. America had produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944 while Germany produced 40,000. America had trained hundreds of thousands of pilots while Germany scraped together boys with 20 hours of flight time and sent them up to die. The mathematics were obscene. Hitler picked up another document, a report from 1942 detailing sabotage operations planned against American infrastructure. Operation Pastorius, 8 agents. Objective: destroy aluminum plants, hydroelectric facilities, railroad terminals. Result: all agents captured within 14 days. 6 executed. Mission failure. He turned the page. Operation Elster, 2 agents. Objective: gather intelligence on Manhattan Project. Result: agents surrendered to FBI. Mission failure. Another page. Operation Magpie, network of sympathizers to coordinate labor strikes in defense plants. Result: network penetrated by FBI. Multiple arrests. Mission failure. 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 Hitler closed the folder. His jaw tightened. They had told him American security was lax. That the FBI was a domestic police force, unprepared for sophisticated espionage. That the OSS was amateurs playing at intelligence work. They had been wrong about everything. The Americans had dismantled every network, caught every agent, prevented every operation. Not through brutality or mass surveillance, but through something the German intelligence services had failed to anticipate: competence. Quiet, methodical, unglamorous competence. Hitler stood and walked to the map on the wall, the same map he had studied in March, now updated with new pins. The Red Territory had shrunk further. Soviet forces were in the suburbs of Berlin. American and British forces had crossed the Elbe. The blue pins surrounded him. He stared at them for a long moment, then spoke aloud to the empty room. We never understood them. His voice was soft, almost wondering. We thought they were weak because they valued comfort. We thought they were divided because they argued freely. We thought they were unprepared because they had not wanted war. He touched one of the blue pins, an American armored division, now less than 100 kilometers away. We thought, he continued, that a nation built on individualism could not sustain collective sacrifice. That a people who loved luxury could not endure hardship. That a democracy could not move with the speed and purpose of a totalitarian state. His hand dropped. We were wrong about all of it. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Hitler returned to his chair. He picked up one final document, a production comparison chart, dated March 1945. Someone had prepared it meticulously, listing German output alongside American output across every category. Tanks, Germany 19,000, total, 1944. America 17,500, total, 1944. At first glance, competitive. But then the next line. Trucks, Germany 88,000. America 562,000. Aircraft, Germany 40,000. America 96,000. Naval vessels, Germany 189. America 2,247. The numbers went on. Page after page. Each line a small defeat. Each total a larger catastrophe. Hitler set the document down and closed his eyes. He thought about Karl-Heinz Weber, though he did not know that name. He thought about all the agents sent across the Atlantic with explosives and training and confidence, who had stood in American factories and realized the same thing Karl had realized. That they were insects trying to stop a flood. He thought about the intelligence officers who had written those optimistic reports, who had told him what he needed to hear because the truth was unacceptable. He thought about himself, reading those reports and believing them, because the alternative was admitting that Germany had challenged a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity and no way to strike at its heartland. The equation had never been solvable. They had simply refused to acknowledge it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Herein," Hitler said quietly. Bormann entered, his face gray with exhaustion. "Mein Führer, the situation report." "I don't need another situation report," Hitler interrupted. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I know the situation." Bormann hesitated. "The Soviets have broken through in the north. General Weidling recommends." "It doesn't matter what Weidling recommends," Hitler said. "The outcome is already determined. It was determined years ago. We simply didn't see it." Bormann stood frozen, uncertain how to respond. Hitler looked up at him. "Do you know what our intelligence services told me about America, Bormann? They told me it was a nation of shopkeepers and farmers, incapable of sustaining a modern war. They told me their factories were vulnerable, their society fractured, their will fragile." He gestured at the folders on the table. "They told me we could disrupt their production, delay their mobilization, buy ourselves time to consolidate Europe before they became a factor." His voice remained eerily calm. "They told me everything except the truth. Mein Führer. The truth," Hitler continued, "is that we declared war on a nation that could build a bomber in 63 minutes. A nation that turned automobile factories into tank factories in a matter of months. A nation that trained pilots faster than we could shoot them down." He stood slowly, his movements stiff. "The truth is that our intelligence failed not because our agents were incompetent, but because the reality they discovered was so far beyond our assumptions that we could not accept it. So we dismissed their warnings. We clung to our prejudices. We believed what we needed to believe." Hitler walked to the map one final time. He stared at the shrinking red territory, the advancing blue pins. "We lost this war," he said quietly, "the moment we failed to understand who we were fighting. Not in 1945. Not in 1944. Not even in 1941 when we declared war." He turned to face Bormann. "We lost it in 1935, when our intelligence services began telling us comfortable lies about American weakness. When we built our strategies on fantasy instead of fact. When we convinced ourselves that an ideology could overcome industrial mathematics." His pale eyes held Bormann's. "We lost it the moment we stopped asking the right questions." Bormann said nothing. There was nothing to say. Hitler returned to his chair. He looked once more at the production charts, the failed operation reports, the optimistic assessments that had aged into epitaphs. "Leave me," he said. Bormann left quickly, grateful for the dismissal. Hitler sat alone in the concrete tomb, surrounded by the evidence of his intelligence failure. Above him, the city burned. Around him, the Reich collapsed. Before him, the documents lay scattered like accusations. He had wanted to believe America was weak. So his intelligence services had told him it was weak. He had wanted to believe sabotage could cripple their production. So his intelligence services had planned operations doomed to fail. He had wanted to believe the war was winnable. So his intelligence services had given him reports that said it was winnable. Until the silence became too loud to ignore. Until the absence of chaos became more telling than any report. Until the mathematics became undeniable. Hitler picked up the production chart one last time. His finger traced the numbers, the impossible, obscene, undeniable numbers. 17,000 tanks. 96,000 aircraft. 2,000 ships. All built by a nation his intelligence had told him was unprepared for war. He set the document down carefully. Then, for the first time in years, Adolf Hitler allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he had spent the entire war avoiding. Germany had never had a chance. Not because of tactics or strategy or battlefield decisions, but because they had gone to war against an enemy they had never bothered to understand. And by the time they realized their mistake, it was far too late to matter. The concrete walls pressed in. The artillery rumbled above. The Reich died in pieces around him. And in the silence of the bunker, surrounded by the lies his intelligence had told him, Hitler finally understood. The war had been lost before it began. They just hadn't known it yet.